The cold metal of the gun barrel pressed into the soft skin beneath my chin, forcing my head back until the stars over the harbor blurred into streaks of white light. Rain mixed with the copper tang of blood in my mouth. "Open," Kenji whispered, his voice a low vibration that crawled down my spine. He didn't sound like a man about to commit a murder. He sounded like a priest offering a final sacrament. My teeth chattered, a rhythmic clicking that echoed in the hollow space of my skull. I looked past the dark silhouette of his shoulder to the black water of the Tokyo Bay, churning with the incoming tide. One shove and I'd be another nameless ghost in the silt. Kenji's thumb grazed the hammer of the Beretta, a mechanical click that sounded like a thunderclap in the silence. My fingers twitched, brushing against the stiff, hidden seam of my jacket where the wire sat, a silent, plastic serpent coiled against my ribs. It was still recording. Every breath, every heartbeat, every drop of rain hitting the pavement was being transmitted to a van 3 blocks away. But as Kenji leaned in, his breath warm against my freezing ear, I realized the sirens weren't coming. This wasn't supposed to be the end of the line. I was the ghost, the shadow in the corner of the room that the Dragon Syndicate forgot to count. For 6 months I had been the perfect soldier, the man who spoke only when spoken to and moved bodies without asking for names. I had built a fortress of silence, believing that as long as I kept my mouth shut, the truth buried in my chest would stay cold. I was wrong. Silence isn't a shield in this world, it's a target. I had traded my soul for a badge and a chance to burn the empire from the inside, but the fire was currently licking at my own heels. If you've ever felt the suffocating weight of a secret that could destroy everything you love, then you know exactly why my hands were shaking. 3 months before the pier, I stood in the back of a dimly lit gambling den in Roppongi, my back against a wall peeling with damp wallpaper. The air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and cheap desperation. Kenji, the Iron Heir of the Syndicate, sat at the center table, his tailored suit sharp enough to cut glass. He didn't look at the cards. He looked at the men around him, his eyes scanning for the slightest flicker of a lie. I held a tray of drinks, my grip steady, my face a mask of bored indifference. My mission was simple: wait for the meeting with the senator, record the transaction, and get out. A man across the table, a low-level enforcer named Sato, reached for his glass. His hand trembled just enough to make the ice clink. Kenji's eyes locked onto the sound. The room went silent. The players froze. Kenji reached out, not for his cards but for Sato's wrist. He squeezed. Sato's face turned the color of ash. "The count is off, Sato," Kenji said, his voice smooth as silk. 5 million yen. "Where is it?" Sato stammered, his eyes darting toward the exit. I shifted my weight, feeling the weight of the transmitter tucked into my waistband. I needed him to talk. I needed the confession. But Sato didn't talk. He broke. He lunged for a hidden blade in his sleeve, but Kenji was faster. In one fluid motion, the table was overturned, and Kenji's fist collided with Sato's jaw. The sound of bones snapping echoed through the room. I stepped forward, not to help, but to maintain my cover. I grabbed Sato by the collar, hauling him away from the wreckage as the other guards closed in. "Take him to the basement," Kenji commanded, wiping a stray drop of blood from his cufflink. He looked at me, then really looked at me for the first time. "You. What's your name?" "Ren," I replied, my voice flat. "Ren," he repeated, tasting the word. "You don't talk much. I like that. A man who speaks too much is a man who thinks he's more important than the family." He stepped closer, his presence an oppressive heat. He reached out and straightened my collar, his fingers inches from the microphone hidden in my lapel. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I didn't flinch. I kept my gaze fixed on the wall behind him. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "Keep him quiet. If he screams, make him stop." I dragged Sato down the narrow concrete stairs, the smell of mildew and old blood rising to meet us. This was the first test. The syndicate didn't just hire muscles, they forged loyalty in the dark. I threw Sato onto a wooden chair and pulled a roll of heavy tape from a shelf. My hands moved with a precision I didn't know I possessed. I wasn't thinking about the man's pain, I was thinking about the frequency on my wire, wondering if the team outside could hear the wet thud of my boots on the floor. Sato looked at me with pleading eyes, his mouth working but no sound coming out. I leaned in close, pretending to tighten the bindings. "If you want to live, stay silent," I whispered so low it was barely a breath. I wasn't doing it for him. I was doing it to keep the room quiet for the recording. But as I pulled back, I saw the door at the top of the stairs creak open. A sliver of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the stairs. Kenji was standing there watching. He hadn't left. He was testing the silence. He stayed for 10 minutes, a shadow among shadows, before finally closing the door. I didn't breathe until I heard his footsteps fade down the hallway. I reached into my pocket and felt the small, cold dial of the transmitter. I turned it up. The game had truly begun, and the first move was mine. The basement felt like a tomb by the second hour. Sato was a broken heap of a man, and I was the one holding the shovel. Every few minutes I'd pace the room, checking the windows that were nothing more than iron-grated slits at street level. I could see the tires of passing cars and the flicker of neon signs reflecting in the puddles. Somewhere out there, my handler, Detective Miller, was listening to the static of my life. I knew the protocol: no contact unless the eagle landed. The eagle was the senator, the man who provided the political grease for the syndicate's gears. The door groaned open again. It wasn't Kenji this time. It was a man they called the surgeon, a tall, skeletal figure carrying a leather bag that rattled with the sound of metal tools. He didn't look at me. He went straight to Sato. "The boss wants to know about the ledger," the surgeon said, his voice rasping like sandpaper. He began laying out his instruments on a stained table: pliers, scalpels, and a heavy industrial torch. "He hasn't said a word," I said, stepping between the surgeon and the chair. My pulse was a frantic drum in my ears. If the surgeon started his work, Sato would scream, the police would have to move in to save him, and the entire 6-month operation would vanish into smoke. "Move, Rin," the surgeon hissed. "Silence is for the loyal. This one is a rat." I didn't move. I calculated the distance to the door, the weight of the scalpel on the table, and the probability of me making it out of the building alive if I took this man down. "Kenji told me to keep him quiet," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "If you start cutting, he makes noise. If he makes noise, the boss gets annoyed. Do you want to be the one who annoys the boss?" The skeletal man hesitated, his hand hovering over a pair of rusted pliers. He looked at me, his eyes two hollow pits of malice. We stood there for an eternity, the only sound the dripping of a leaky pipe in the corner. Then the intercom on the wall buzzed. "Bring the prisoner up. The guest has arrived." The guest. The senator. This was it. I hauled Sato to his feet, his knees buckling under the weight of his fear. We walked back up the stairs, past the guards who looked at us like we were already dead men walking. We were led into a private office at the back of the club, a room filled with the scent of old leather and expensive bourbon. Kenji was sitting behind a massive oak desk. Opposite him sat a man in a charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. "Senator Tanaka." "Sit," Kenji commanded. I pushed Sato into a chair in the corner and took my place by the door, my heart hammering. I shifted my stance, ensuring the microphone was angled toward the desk. "The ledger, Senator," Kenji said, sliding a black book across the polished wood. "The names of every officer on the payroll, the offshore accounts, and the dates of the shipments. It's all there." Tanaka reached for the book, his fingers trembling slightly. "And my guarantee?" "Your guarantee is my silence," Kenji replied. "As long as the ports stay open, the book stays in my vault. If an investigation starts, the book finds its way to the press." I felt a surge of triumph. We had it. The names, the crimes, the connection. All I had to do was walk out of this room and signal the team. But then Kenji's gaze shifted from the senator to me. He didn't say anything. He just stared. He stood up slowly and walked around the desk, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. He stopped inches away from me. "You've been very helpful today, Rin," he said. He reached out and patted my shoulder, his hand lingering a second too long. So helpful, in fact, that I started wondering why a man with your talents is content being a waiter. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned to the senator. "Wait in the car, Tanaka. We'll finish this tomorrow." The senator scrambled out of the room, leaving me alone with Kenji and the broken man in the corner. Kenji walked to a small bookshelf and pulled out a device no larger than a pack of cigarettes. He flipped a switch. A high-pitched whine filled the room, a sound so sharp it made my teeth ache. "Do you know what this is, Ren?" Kenji asked. "It's a frequency jammer. It detects unauthorized transmissions." He looked at the device, then back at me. The LED light on the top was glowing a bright, angry red. "Someone in this room is broadcasting. And it isn't Sato." My blood turned to ice. My hand moved instinctively toward the door handle, but I heard the click of a hammer being cocked behind me. The surgeon was standing there, a silenced pistol leveled at my chest. "Take it off," Kenji said, his voice now devoid of any warmth. "Take it off, or I'll let him start the surgery on you while you're still standing. If you believe that a man's true character is revealed only when he's staring down the barrel of a gun, then hit the like button so Ren's sacrifice means something to the people watching. I didn't move. I couldn't. The world had narrowed down to the red light on that device in the black hole of the gun barrel. I reached slowly into my jacket, my fingers brushing the warm plastic of the wire. I pulled it out, the thin adhesive tearing away from my skin with a sound like a dying breath. I dropped it on the floor. It looked pathetic, a tangle of wires and tape that represented 6 months of my life. Kenji stepped on it, the plastic crunching under his heel. He didn't look angry, he looked disappointed. Who are you working for? Miller? Sato? The feds. It doesn't matter, I said, the mask finally slipping. My voice was steady even if my soul was screaming. The data is already gone. Every word you said to the senator is on a server 10 miles from here. Kenji smiled then, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. You think we didn't know about the van? You think we didn't see the tail? We've been feeding you exactly what we wanted the police to hear for 3 weeks, Ren. The senator? That wasn't Tanaka. That was an actor. The ledger? A list of grocery items and fake names. He leaned in, his face inches from mine. We didn't want to catch a spy. We wanted to see who the spy would lead us to. And you led us right to the main precinct's back door. He grabbed me by the throat, his grip like iron. But now the game is boring. And I hate being bored. He threw me against the wall, the back of my head bouncing off the wood. The room spun. The surgeon stepped forward, but Kenji held up a hand. No, not here. The harbor. I want him to see the city he tried to save one last time. They dragged me out through the back alley, the cold rain hitting my face like 1,000 tiny needles. I was tossed into the trunk of a black sedan, the darkness swallowing me whole. The car moved, the vibrations of the road shaking my bones. I tried to reach for the hidden blade in my boot, but my hands were zip-tied behind my back. I was a passenger in my own execution. When the trunk finally opened, the air smelled of salt and diesel. We were at the pier. The same pier where I had watched them dump bodies months ago. Kenji hauled me out, his grip bruising my arm. We walked to the edge of the dock, where the water slapped against the pilings with a rhythmic, mocking sound. He pressed the gun to my head. This was the moment. The shock I felt wasn't from the fear of death, but from the realization of how easily I had been played. I wasn't the hunter. I was the bait. Any last words, Ren? Kenji asked. Any secrets you want to give me before you join the others? I looked at him, the rain blurring my vision. You missed one, I whispered. Kenji frowned, his finger tightening on the trigger. Missed what? The wire, I said. I wasn't wearing one. I was wearing 2. I kicked out with all my strength, catching him in the shin. He hissed in pain, his aim wavering for a fraction of a second. I didn't run for the car. I ran for the edge. I didn't care about the fall. I didn't care about the cold. I just needed to get deep enough. I hit the water like a stone, the shock of the cold knocking the air from my lungs. I sank into the darkness, the sound of gunshots muffled by the pressure of the bay. Above me, the surface of the water was a shimmering mirror, broken by the orange flash of muzzles. I kicked my legs, the zip ties cutting into my wrists, and pushed myself deeper into the silt. My lungs burned. My vision began to fade into a dull gray. I thought about the second wire, the one hidden not on my chest but in the heel of my boot. It wasn't a transmitter. It was a GPS beacon. I had activated it the moment I felt the gun against my head. I drifted in the current, my heart slowing down, the silence of the deep closing in around me. I was waiting for the light. Not the light of the afterlife, but the blue and red strobe of the harbor patrol. But as I looked up through the murky water, I didn't see sirens. I saw a dark shape descending toward me. A diver. He moved with a predatory grace, his black wetsuit blending into the shadows. He reached out and grabbed me, his hand locking onto my shoulder. He pulled a knife from his thigh and sliced through the zip ties. I gasped, swallowing a mouthful of salt water, my eyes bulging. He pressed a regulator into my mouth, and the first hit of compressed air felt like life itself. He pulled me toward a small, underwater propulsion vehicle. We moved fast, away from the pier and the men with guns. When we finally broke the surface, we were under the shadow of an old, rusted freighter a mile away. The diver pulled off his mask. It wasn't a cop. It was Sato. He looked at me, his jaw swollen and purple, but his eyes were sharp and clear. You thought you were the only one Miller sent in? He rasped. You're a rookie, Ren. You were the distraction. I'm the one with the real ledger. He pulled a waterproof pouch from his suit and tapped it. Now let's go finish what you started. We climbed onto the freighter, our boots clanging on the rusted metal. The ship was a ghost, a relic of a forgotten era, but it was our only sanctuary. Sato led me to the bridge where a laptop was already set up, its screen glowing with rows of encrypted data. How? I asked, my voice a ragged whisper. My body was shaking so hard I had to lean against the bulkhead. Kenji said the ledger was fake. He said they were feeding us lies. They were, Sato said, his fingers flying across the keys. They fed you lies. They wanted you to be the one they caught. While you were playing waiter and getting kicked around, I was in the server room at the club. The 5 million yen Kenji thought I stole? I didn't steal it. I used it to buy the access codes from their head of security. He looked at me, a grim smile on his face. You were the best shield I ever had, Rin. Your silence was so convincing they never looked at the man who was screaming. I felt a wave of nausea. I had been a pawn not just to the syndicate but to my own side. Miller had sent me in to be the lamb, knowing I'd get caught, knowing Kenji would focus all his attention on breaking me while the real work happened in the shadows. The beacon in your boot, Sato continued. It didn't just alert us. It triggered a wipe of their mainframe. Right now, Kenji is standing on that pier realizing that his entire digital empire is dissolving. He has nothing. No names, no accounts, no leverage. The ship's radio crackled to life. Eagle 1 to nest. We have the package. Moving to extraction. That's our cue, Sato said. He handed me a dry jacket and a heavy pistol. The harbor patrol is moving in on the pier. But Kenji won't be there. He's headed for the helipad on the roof of the Roppongi building. He's going to try to burn the physical evidence before he flees. Then we go to Roppongi, I said, the cold in my bones turning into a hard, sharp heat. No, Sato said. I go to the precinct with the ledger. You're burned. You go to the safe house and wait for Miller. I looked at the pistol in my hand. I thought about the way Kenji's breath felt against my ear. I thought about the 6 months of silence, the fear, and the taste of the bay water. I'm not waiting anymore, I said. I turned and ran for the small skiff tied to the side of the freighter. I heard Sato calling my name, but I didn't stop. I hit the engine and the small boat lurched forward, cutting through the waves. The city skyline loomed ahead, a forest of glass and light that hid 1,000 monsters. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was the fire. If you think the quiet ones are the most dangerous when they finally break, subscribe to hear more stories about the people the world forgot to watch. The Roppongi building was a spire of obsidian against the midnight sky. I abandoned the boat 3 blocks away and moved through the shadows of the alleyways. My heart was a steady, rhythmic thrum. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical focus. I knew the layout of the building better than I knew my own mother's face. I had memorized the blueprints every night for months. I entered through the service tunnel, the air smelling of exhaust and grease. 2 guards stood by the elevator bank, their suits bulging with the weight of their weapons. I didn't wait for them to see me. I used a heavy pipe from the wall to silence the first one, then took the second one down with a swift strike to the throat. I didn't feel anything. No guilt, no hesitation. Just the mission. I took the service elevator to the 40th floor. When the doors opened, the sound of a shredder was the first thing I heard. The office was a chaotic mess of paper and shattered glass. Kenji was at the center of it, his tie loose, his hair disheveled. He was throwing files into a burning metal bin. He heard the elevator and spun around, his gun raised. When he saw it was me, he laughed, a jagged, desperate sound. The ghost returns, he spat. You should have stayed in the water, Rin. It was a cleaner death. The water was cold, Kenji, I said, stepping into the room. I didn't raise my gun. I just walked toward him. But not as cold as your bank accounts are right now. His face contorted with rage. He fired. The bullet grazed my shoulder, spinning me around, but I didn't stop. I lunged at him, my weight carrying us both over the desk. We hit the floor in a tangle of limbs and fury. He was stronger, but I was faster. I jammed my thumb into his wound from the pier and he screamed. We rolled across the floor, through the fire and the paper. He grabbed a heavy glass award from the desk and smashed it against my ribs. I felt a rib snap, but I wrapped my arm around his neck, squeezing with everything I had. You're nothing, Kenji wheezed, his face turning a deep, bruised purple. You're a servant. I whispered into his ear. But tonight, I'm the one who settles the debt. I felt his body go limp. I didn't kill him. I wanted him to be awake when the sirens arrived. I wanted him to see his world crumble from the inside of a cage. I sat back on the floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the fire in the bin casting long, flickering shadows on the wall. Outside, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, a thin line of gold against the gray. The sound of helicopters grew louder, their searchlights cutting through the smoke of the room. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled photograph, the one I had carried every day. It was a picture of my sister, the one the Syndicate had taken from me 5 years ago. I placed it on the desk in the center of the ruins. "It's over, Hannah," I whispered. "If you believe that justice is a debt that must always be paid, hit the like button so this story reaches the ones who are still waiting for their turn." I walked out of the building as the tactical team swarmed in. They didn't stop me. They didn't even see me. I was just another man in a dark jacket, blending into the crowd of onlookers and early morning commuters. I walked until my legs gave out, finally sitting on a bench in a small park overlooking the city. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from an unknown number. "The ledger is secure. The senator is in custody. Miller wants to see you. Don't come in yet. There's a second list." I looked at the screen for a long time. The second list. The cycle never ended. There would always be another boss, another wire, another bridge to burn. I stood up and tossed the phone into a nearby trash can. I looked at my hands. They were covered in soot and blood, the skin raw and peeling. I started walking, not toward the precinct and not toward the safe house. I walked toward the train station. I had spent 6 months being a ghost for the law, and another 5 years being a ghost for my grief. For the first time in my life, I didn't want to be a shadow. As the train pulled into the station, I felt a strange lightness in my chest. The weight of the wire was gone. The weight of the silence was gone. I stepped onto the car and watched as the Roppongi building faded into the distance, a dark needle lost in a sea of morning light. I didn't know where the track ended and I didn't care. I sat by the window and watched the world go by, people going to work, children laughing, the mundane, beautiful reality of a life lived out loud. I closed my eyes and for the first time in years, I wasn't listening for a secret. I was just listening to the wind. And in that moment, I knew that the man who had stood on that pier was dead, and the man who was left was finally, truly free. The train hummed beneath me, a steady rhythmic vibration that felt like a pulse. I watched the cityscape of Tokyo bleed into the industrial outskirts. Gray warehouses and rusting cranes flickered past the window like frames of a film I no longer starred in. My ribs throbbed with every shallow breath, a sharp reminder of Kenji's desperation, but the pain was grounded, it was real. It wasn't the hollow, phantom ache of a lie. I touched the empty space on my lapel where the microphone used to be. My skin felt bare, exposed, but for the first time in 6 months, I didn't have to filter my thoughts through a transmitter. I stepped off at a small station 3 hours north of the city. The air here was different, sharp with the scent of pine and salt from the northern coast. I walked toward a cluster of modest houses nestled against the hillside. I stopped in front of a small white house with a sagging porch and a garden overtaken by weeds. This was the place Miller told me to go if everything went dark. He called it the Shadow Protocol. A safe house so off the grid that even the department didn't have the coordinates. I reached under the third porch step and found the key taped to the underside of the wood. The lock groaned as I turned it. Inside, the house smelled of dust and old newspapers. I didn't turn on the lights. I moved through the dark, my eyes adjusting to the faint silver glow of the moon filtering through the blinds. I found the kitchen and drank 3 glasses of lukewarm tap water, the liquid feeling like silk in my parched throat. I sat at the small wooden table and opened the envelope Miller had left for me weeks ago. Inside was a new passport, a stack of yen, and a single handwritten note. The second list isn't just Syndicate. It's the blue wall. Stay hidden until I signal. The dragon has many heads. I stared at the note until the words blurred. The blue wall. Internal affairs. My own people. The realization hit me harder than Kenji's fist. Miller wasn't just investigating the Syndicate. He was investigating the precinct. And I wasn't just a snitch, I was a Trojan horse. I looked at the passport, the name on it was Hiroshi Tanaka. A ghost name. A new life. But as I traced the edge of the paper, I heard a sound from the porch. A soft, rhythmic creak. The sound of a floorboard underweight. I froze. I didn't reach for my gun, it was still in the skiff at the harbor. I reached for the heavy iron skillet on the stove, my fingers locking onto the handle. I stood against the wall, my heart hammering against my fractured ribs. The door handle turned slowly. The hinges didn't make a sound. A shadow stepped into the kitchen, a tall figure in a dark coat. "Put the pan down, Rin," a voice whispered. It was Miller. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him. His face was a map of exhaustion, his eyes bloodshot. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man who had seen the bottom of the world and decided to stay there. "You weren't supposed to be here," I said, my voice rasping. "The precinct was raided an hour ago," Miller said, sliding into the chair opposite mine. Internal affairs. They seized everything. The ledger, the recordings, the evidence against Tanaka. Everything. Sato? I asked, the name feeling like a lead weight in my mouth. Miller looked down at his hands. He didn't make it to the precinct. They found his car in the river. The ledger is gone, Ren. The dragon didn't just survive, it swallowed the evidence. I felt the room tilt. 6 months of silence. Sato's life. My own near death. All of it erased in a single hour. Then what was the point? I asked, the words coming out as a choked sob. The point, Miller said, leaning forward until his face was inches from mine, is that they don't know about the second list. They think they got it all. But Sato wasn't just carrying the ledger. He was carrying a key. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver thumb drive. He swallowed it before the car hit the water. I got it from the morgue before they could process him. Miller pushed the drive across the table. This is the second list, Ren. The names of the officers who are on the syndicate's payroll. The ones who raided the precinct. The ones who killed Sato. He looked at me with a desperate, burning intensity. I can't take this to the department. I can't take it to the feds. I need someone who doesn't exist to finish this. I'm done being a ghost, Miller, I said, pushing the drive back. You're not a ghost yet, Miller said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. But if you don't take this, you'll be a memory by sunrise. They're coming for us, Ren. And they're not using badges. They're using silencers. As if on cue, the windows of the small kitchen shattered. A hail of glass rained down on us as the sound of a high-powered rifle echoed through the pines. Miller threw himself over the table, tackling me to the floor as a second shot splintered the wooden chair where I had been sitting seconds before. The signal, Miller hissed, his hand gripping my shoulder. They found the signal from your boot. We have to move. Now. We crawled toward the back door, the sound of boots on the porch echoing like drumbeats. I grabbed the thumb drive from the floor, the cold metal biting into my palm. I didn't know if I could survive another night in the dark, but as I looked at Miller, I realized there was no other way out. The only way to stop being a ghost was to burn the world that made me one. We burst through the back door and into the freezing night air, the forest swallowing us whole. The pine needles cushioned our footsteps, but the forest was a labyrinth of shadows. Behind us, the beams of tactical flashlights cut through the trees like searchlights. They weren't calling out orders. They weren't identifying themselves. They moved with the silent, lethal efficiency of a hit squad. Who are they, Miller? I whispered as we crouched behind a moss-covered boulder. Special Response Team, Miller panted, his chest heaving. The same ones who protected Sato. They're not here to arrest us. They're here to clean the slate. I looked at the thumb drive in my hand. We have to get this to the press. We have to bypass the system entirely. No, Miller said, his eyes darting toward the encroaching lights. The press won't touch it without a witness. A ghost's word isn't enough. We need the physical evidence from the Roppongi vault. The one Kenji didn't have time to burn. He said he burned it all, I argued. He lied, Miller said. Kenji is a narcissist. He kept a backup of the blue list, in a private safe at his sister's estate. It's his insurance policy against his own family. Kenji's sister. Anna. The name hit me like a physical blow. The syndicate hadn't just taken my sister, they had replaced her with one of their own. Hannah wasn't just Kenji's sister, she was the architect of the syndicate's legal defense. She was the one who turned blood money into clean assets. We can't get into that estate, Miller, I said. It's a fortress. We don't have to get in, Miller said, a grim smile playing on his lips. We just have to make her think the dragon is turning on her. If she thinks Kenji is cutting a deal, she'll run for the evidence herself. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small encrypted radio. I still have one contact inside. Someone who hasn't been turned. But I need you to be the messenger. Why me? Because she knows you're dead, Miller said. And nothing scares a liar more than a ghost who knows the truth. A gunshot rang out, the bullet whining off the rock inches from my head. Miller pushed me toward the ravine. Go. I'll draw them off. Meet me at the shrine in Ueno at midnight. If I'm not there, you know what to do. I didn't have time to argue. I scrambled down the steep embankment, the branches tearing at my face and clothes. I hit the bottom of the ravine and kept running, my lungs burning, my fractured ribs screaming with every step. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I reached the highway an hour later, my clothes soaked and covered in mud. I flagged down a passing truck, a rusted produce hauler heading toward the city. The driver didn't ask questions. He just looked at my bloodied face and gestured to the back. I climbed in among the crates of cabbage, the smell of earth and rot filling my senses. As the truck rumbled toward Tokyo, I pulled out the thumb drive. I knew what I had to do. I didn't have a gun and I didn't have a badge, but I had the truth. And in a world built on lies, the truth is the most lethal weapon of all. I reached the city as the sun was beginning to set, the neon lights of Shinjuku flickering to life like a fever dream. I made my way to the upscale district of Azabujuban, where the syndicate's elite lived in walled compounds. I found Hana's estate, a sleek, modern structure of glass and steel surrounded by a high stone wall. I didn't try to climb the wall. I walked straight to the main gate and pressed the intercom. "Who is it?" a woman's voice asked, sharp and impatient. "Tell Hana that Ren is here," I said, my voice cold and steady. "Tell her the pier didn't take me. And tell her I have the second wire." There was a long silence. Then the heavy iron gates began to slide open. I walked up the long gravel driveway, the sound of my boots echoing against the glass walls of the house. Hana was standing on the terrace, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked exactly like Kenji, the same sharp features, the same predatory eyes. But where Kenji was fire, she was ice. "You're a persistent ghost, Ren," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "I'm not a ghost, Hana," I said, stopping at the base of the terrace. "I'm the debt collector. And I'm here to collect for Sato." She laughed, a cold, hollow sound. Sato was a fool. He thought he could play both sides. And look where it got him. "It got him a seat at the table," I said, holding up the thumb drive. "And it got me this. The list of the officers your brother is about to name in his plea deal." The glass in her hand froze. "Kenji isn't talking." "He is now," I lied, my voice never wavering. "Miller found him at the hospital. He's trading you for his life, Hana. He's telling them about the safe. The one in this house." I saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes. It was only for a second, but it was enough. The mask was cracking. "He wouldn't," she whispered. "He already has," I said. "The police are on their way. Not the ones you pay, Hana. The real ones. If you want to survive, you need to get that evidence and get out of here. Now." She stared at me for an eternity, her mind racing. Then, without a word, she turned and ran back into the house. I followed her, my heart racing. We reached the library, where she moved a heavy bronze statue to reveal a small, digital keypad. She punched in the code, and the wall slid open to reveal a small, hidden safe. She reached inside and pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. "The blue list." "I have it," she breathed, her face pale. "Now give it to me," I said, stepping forward. But before she could move, the front door burst open. A group of men in dark coats and tactical gear stormed into the room. It wasn't the police. It was the SRT. The hit squad. "Hana, move!" I shouted, diving toward her as the first shots rang out. The first bullet shattered a Ming vase on the pedestal behind Hana, sending shards of porcelain flying like shrapnel. I tackled her to the floor, my shoulder slamming into her ribs as we rolled behind a heavy mahogany desk. The ledger, the blue list, skidded across the polished floor, stopping just inches from the reach of the lead gunman. "Who are they?" Hana screamed, her composure shattered. "Your payroll, Hana?" I yelled over the deafening roar of a submachine gun. "The SRT. They're not here to save the evidence, they're here to bury it with us." The hit squad moved with terrifying synchronization. They didn't shout police or freeze. They just poured lead into the desk, the mahogany splintering under the onslaught. I looked at Hana. Her eyes were wide, the reality of her world finally catching up to her. The men she had bribed to protect her were now the ones squeezing the triggers. "The ledger," she gasped, pointing toward the book. "Forget the book. We need to move." I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the library's back door, a heavy oak portal that led to the servants' corridor. We burst through just as a grenade detonated in the library, the shockwave throwing us into the wall. My ears rang with a high-pitched whine, and the smell of ozone and burnt carpet filled the air. We stumbled through the narrow hallway, the sound of boots echoing behind us. I saw a small window at the end of the hall that opened onto the estate's garden. "Out there." I shoved Hana toward the window. She scrambled through, her silk dress tearing on the frame, and I followed, landing hard on the damp grass. We ran through the manicured hedges, the garden lights illuminating us like targets. The car. Hana pointed toward a silver Lexus parked in the secondary driveway. We reached it just as the hit squad emerged from the house. I dove into the driver's seat, and Hana scrambled into the passenger side. I didn't have the keys, but I didn't need them. I ripped the panel under the steering column and touched the wires. The engine roared to life. I slammed the car into reverse, tires screeching as we tore through the stone gate. A volley of gunfire sparked against the rear window, the reinforced glass spider-webbing but holding. We hit the main road, the city lights a blur of neon and motion. "Why are you helping me?" Hannah asked, her voice trembling. She was clutching her side, her face the color of ash. "I'm not helping you," I said, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. Two black SUVs were weaving through traffic behind us. "I'm helping the truth. And right now, you're the only one who can verify that ledger." "I don't have it," she whispered. I looked at her. Her hands were empty. "What?" "I dropped it, in the library. When the grenade went off." I slammed my fist against the steering wheel. "Then we have nothing. Sato died for nothing." "No," Hannah said, reaching into the waistband of her skirt. She pulled out a small encrypted key fob. "The ledger was just the record. This is the access to the Syndicate's offshore server. Every payment, every wiretap, every dirty cop's bank account is on that drive. It's the real blue list." She looked at me, a flicker of her old defiance returning. "Kenji thought I was his lawyer. He didn't realize I was his jailer. I built the system, Rin. I'm the only one who can take it down." "Then we go to Miller," I said, swerving through a red light. "Who is Miller?" "The only man in this city who isn't for sale." We reached the Ueno shrine at midnight. The park was a dark, silent expanse of trees and stone lanterns. I parked the car in a secluded lot and we made our way toward the main gate. The air was cold and the sound of my own footsteps felt like an alarm. Miller was waiting by the large stone fox statues. He looked like a ghost in the moonlight, his coat tattered and his face bruised. He saw us and stepped forward, his hand on his holster. "You brought her," he said, his voice flat. "She has the key, Miller," I said. "The real list. Offshore accounts, everything." Miller looked at Hannah, his eyes narrowing. "Why should I trust you?" "You shouldn't," Hannah said, stepping forward. "But I have nowhere else to go. My brother tried to kill me tonight. My employees tried to kill me. Right now the only thing keeping me alive is this key." She held out the fob. Miller reached for it, but before his fingers could touch the plastic, a red laser dot appeared on his chest. "Miller, move!" I screamed. A shot rang out, a dull thud that echoed in the silent park. Miller fell back, his hand clutching his shoulder. A second shot hit the stone statue next to me, showering us with sparks. Behind the fox. I pulled Hannah down as a third shot tore through the air. I looked up toward the roof of the shrine. A sniper was perched on the eaves, his silhouette clear against the moon. But it wasn't just a sniper. From the shadows of the trees, a dozen men in tactical gear emerged. They didn't have flashlights this time. They had night vision goggles. "Give us the key, Rin," a voice called out from the darkness. It was a voice I recognized. A voice that made my blood run cold. It was Detective Miller's partner. Detective Vance. "Vance?" Miller gasped from the ground, his voice weak. You were the leak?" Vance stepped into the moonlight, his gun leveled at Miller's head. "It wasn't a leak, Miller. It was a career move. The Syndicate pays better than the city ever did. And they have better retirement plans." He looked at me. "The key, Rin. Or the detective dies right here." I looked at the fob in Hannah's hand. I looked at Miller, bleeding on the cold stone. If I gave them the key, the Syndicate would win. The names would be erased and the cycle would continue. But if I didn't, my only friend in the world would be dead. "If you give it to them, they'll kill us all anyway," Hannah whispered, her eyes locked on Vance. "They can't leave witnesses." I knew she was right. But as I looked at Vance, I saw something he didn't. Behind him, in the deep shadows of the shrine, a dark figure was moving. A figure with a long, thin blade. It was Sato. He wasn't dead. The car in the river had been a decoy. He moved with the silence of a shadow, his blade catching the moonlight for only a fraction of a second. "Now!" Sato's voice rang out. In the confusion, I lunged for Vance. Vance's eyes widened as Sato's blade caught the moonlight. The detective's instinct kicked in. He swung his weapon toward the shadow, but he was a second too slow. Sato didn't strike Vance. He sliced the strap of the heavy stone lantern next to him. The massive granite block crashed down, the impact vibrating through the ground and sending a cloud of dust into the air. "Go. To the inner sanctum," Sato shouted, his voice a rasping command. I grabbed Miller by his good arm, hauling him to his feet. He groaned, his face etched with pain, but he leaned into me, his legs churning. Hannah was already running, her heels clicking on the stone path. We burst through the heavy wooden doors of the shrine's main hall, slamming the iron bolts home just as a volley of gunfire chewed through the ancient wood. The interior of the shrine was cool and smelled of incense and old paper. Golden statues of forgotten deities watched us with indifferent eyes. I leaned Miller against a pillar, his blood staining the polished floor. "Sato." Miller wheezed, his eyes flickering. "How?" "The river was shallow," Sato said, stepping into the room from a side entrance. He looked like a man who had walked out of a nightmare. His suit was shredded, and his face was a map of deep cuts and bruises. "I rolled out before the impact. I knew they'd be watching the morgue, so I stayed in the silt. The body they found was a drifter Vance had killed an hour earlier to frame me." He looked at me, a flicker of respect in his cold eyes. "You did well, Rin. You played the bait perfectly. Hana the key." Hana hesitated, her fingers tightening around the silver fob. "If I give this to you, what happens to me?" "You get a head start," Sato said. "The police will be here in 10 minutes. "The real police?" "Miller's contacts in the national agency. They've been tracking Vance's signal since we hit the shrine." 10 minutes is a lifetime out here," I said, listening to the sound of axes hitting the front door. "They're breaking through." "Then we make sure they don't have a lifetime," Sato said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small black cylinder, a flashbang. "Rin, take Miller and Hannah through the priest's tunnel. It leads to the subway entrance. I'll hold them here." "No," I said, stepping forward. "I'm not leaving another friend behind." "You're not a friend, Rin," Sato said, his voice flat. "You're a witness. And right now, you're the only one who can testify against the commissioner. Miller is too close to the case, they'll discredit him. But you're the ghost. You're the one they didn't see coming." The front door splintered, a heavy boot kicking through the gap. Sato pulled the pin on the cylinder and threw it toward the entrance. "Go." The explosion was a white-hot wall of sound and light. I grabbed Hannah and Miller and shoved them toward the small hidden door behind the altar. We scrambled into the narrow, dark tunnel, the sound of gunfire erupting behind us. Sato's blade clashing against metal was the last thing I heard before the door slammed shut. The tunnel was cramped and smelled of damp earth. We moved as fast as Miller's injury would allow, our breath coming in frantic gasps. We reached the end of the tunnel and emerged into the bustling chaos of the Ueno subway station. The lights were too bright, the crowds too loud. We looked like 3 ghosts walking among the living. Vance's eyes widened as Sato's blade caught the moonlight. The detective's instinct kicked in. He swung his weapon toward the shadow, but he was a second too slow. Sato didn't strike Vance. He sliced the strap of the heavy stone lantern next to him. The massive granite block crashed down, the impact vibrating through the ground and sending a cloud of dust into the air. "Go to the inner sanctum," Sato shouted, his voice a rasping command. I grabbed Miller by his good arm, hauling him to his feet. He groaned, his face etched with pain, but he leaned into me, his legs churning. Hannah was already running, her heels clicking on the stone path. We burst through the heavy wooden doors of the shrine's main hall, slamming the iron bolts home just as a volley of gunfire chewed through the ancient wood. The interior of the shrine was cool and smelled of incense and old paper. Golden statues of forgotten deities watched us with indifferent eyes. I leaned Miller against a pillar, his blood staining the polished floor. "Sato." Miller wheezed, his eyes flickering. "How?" "The river was shallow," Sato said, stepping into the room from a side entrance. He looked like a man who had walked out of a nightmare. His suit was shredded, and his face was a map of deep cuts and bruises. "I rolled out before the impact. I knew they'd be watching the morgue, so I stayed in the silt. The body they found was a drifter Vance had killed an hour earlier to frame me." He looked at me, a flicker of respect in his cold eyes. "You did well, Rin. You played the bait perfectly. Hana the key." Hannah hesitated, her fingers tightening around the silver fob. "If I give this to you, what happens to me?" "You get a head start," Sato said. "The police will be here in 10 minutes. "The real police?" "Miller's contacts in the national agency. They've been tracking Vance's signal since we hit the shrine." 10 minutes is a lifetime out here," I said, listening to the sound of axes hitting the front door. "They're breaking through." "Then we make sure they don't have a lifetime," Sato said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small black cylinder, a flashbang. "Rin, take Miller and Hannah through the priest's tunnel. It leads to the subway entrance. I'll hold them here." "No," I said, stepping forward. "I'm not leaving another friend behind." "You're not a friend, Rin," Sato said, his voice flat. "You're a witness. And right now, you're the only one who can testify against the commissioner. Miller is too close to the case, they'll discredit him. But you? You're the ghost. You're the one they didn't see coming. The front door splintered, a heavy boot kicking through the gap. Sato pulled the pin on the cylinder and threw it toward the entrance. Go! The explosion was a white-hot wall of sound and light. I grabbed Hannah and Miller and shoved them toward the small hidden door behind the altar. We scrambled into the narrow, dark tunnel, the sound of gunfire erupting behind us. Sato's blade clashing against metal was the last thing I heard before the door slammed shut. The tunnel was cramped and smelled of damp earth. We moved as fast as Miller's injury would allow, our breath coming in frantic gasps. We reached the end of the tunnel and emerged into the bustling chaos of the Ueno subway station. The lights were too bright, the crowds too loud. We looked like three ghosts walking among the living. The key, Miller whispered, his voice fading. Ren, give me the key. I reached for Hannah, but she was already 3 steps ahead, her eyes darting toward the platform. Hannah, stop! I shouted. She turned, her face a mask of desperation. I can't go to the police, Ren. You know what they'll do to me. The blue list, it isn't just a record of bribes. It's a record of the people I've helped disappear. If I give that to Miller, I'm dead anyway. If you don't, the syndicate continues. I said, stepping closer. Sato is back there dying for that key. Miller is bleeding out for it. Then let them die for a lie. Hannah screamed. She turned and ran toward the edge of the platform as the train roared into the station. I lunged for her, my fingers brushing the silk of her sleeve. She stepped onto the train just as the doors began to hiss shut. I shoved my shoulder into the gap, the metal doors biting into my skin, but I forced my way through. The train was crowded with late-night commuters, their faces buried in phones and books. They didn't see the blood on my clothes or the terror in Hannah's eyes. She backed away from me, her hand reaching for the emergency lever. Give it to me, Hannah, I said, my voice low and dangerous. Stay back, she yelled, her voice cracking. She pulled the lever. The train lurched to a violent stop, the screech of metal on metal echoing through the car. People were thrown from their seats, screaming in confusion. In the chaos, Hannah bolted for the doors as they hissed open. I followed her out onto the tracks, the dark tunnel stretching out ahead of us. We ran past the glowing signal lights, the sound of our footsteps echoing against the concrete. She reached a service ladder and began to climb. I grabbed her ankle, pulling her back. We hit the gravel floor of the tunnel, the key fob skidding into the dark. We scrambled for it, our fingers clawing at the dirt. I felt her hand close over it, but I slammed my weight into her, pinning her against the wall. It's over, Hannah, I hissed. I reached for the key, but as my fingers touched the plastic, I felt a sharp, cold sting in my side. I looked down. Hannah was holding a small, silver pen, a concealed needle. It's a paralytic, Ren, she whispered, her face inches from mine. You'll be awake, but you won't be able to move for an hour. By then, I'll be on a plane to Macau. My legs gave out and I slumped against the wall, the world beginning to spin. I watched as she stood up, wiped the dirt from her dress and picked up the key. You were a good ghost, Ren, she said, leaning down to kiss my forehead. But even ghosts have to rest. She turned and began to climb the ladder. I tried to shout, but my tongue felt like a piece of lead. I watched her disappear into the light of the street above. I lay there in the dark, the sound of the subways hummed the only thing I could hear. I was alone. Sato was gone. Miller was dying. And the key was in the hands of the very woman who built the empire. But as my vision began to fade, I felt a small, hard object in my other hand. I looked down. It was the thumb drive. The one Miller had given me in the kitchen. The second list. Hannah had the offshore access, but I had the names. I had the physical proof of the blue wall. She had the money, but I had the souls. I closed my eyes and focused on the rhythmic thumping of my heart. I wasn't done yet. I just needed to wake up. If you think a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous thing in the world, drop a like so Ren's final move reaches the people who need to see it. The darkness of the tunnel was absolute, but the fire in my mind was brighter than any neon sign. I could feel the paralytic crawling through my veins, a slow, icy tide, but I fought it with every ounce of my will. I pictured Hannah's face, Kenji's smile, Sato's blade. I wouldn't let them win. I began to crawl, my fingers digging into the gravel. Every inch felt like a mile. I reached the ladder and hooked my arm through the bottom rung. I couldn't climb, but I could hang on. I hung there for what felt like an eternity, the sound of the city above me a muffled roar. Then I heard a voice. Ren? Ren, are you there? It was Miller. He was at the top of the ladder, his voice weak but clear. I'm here, I rasped, the word of victory in itself. A flashlight beam cut through the dark, illuminating my face. Miller looked down at me, his eyes filled with relief. He reached down and grabbed my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "I have the list, Miller," I whispered as he hauled me up. "I know," he said. "Sato's alive. He's at the precinct. The agency moved in 5 minutes ago. Vance is in custody." I hit the pavement of the street, the cold air reviving me. I looked at the thumb drive in my hand. Hannah has the access codes. She's headed for Macau. "No," Miller said, a grim smile on his face. "She's headed for the airport. And we have every exit blocked. She isn't going anywhere." We sat there on the sidewalk, two broken men in the middle of a sleeping city. The sun was beginning to rise, the sky turning a soft, pale pink. The nightmare was finally ending. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Miller said, looking at the city skyline, "we tell the truth. All of it." I looked at the thumb drive one last time, then handed it to him. I was done. I didn't want to be a ghost, a witness, or a hero. I just wanted to be Ren. I stood up and started walking, the sun warming my face. I didn't look back. I had a life to start. And for the first time, I knew exactly who I was. The agency's interrogation room was a sterile box of white light and cold air. I sat on the metal chair, my hands cuffed to the table. A formality, Miller said, but it felt like the weight of my past finally settling. Across from me sat a woman with silver hair and eyes like flint. Director Kaguya of the National Police Agency. She didn't have a badge on display, but the way the air in the room seemed to thin when she spoke told me everything I needed to know. 6 months, Ren," she said, her voice a low, melodic thrum. 6 months as a ghost in the dragon's den. Tell me, did you start to enjoy the silence? Or did it start to scream?" "It never stopped screaming, Director," I said, my voice steady. But I wasn't the one doing the shouting. I watched her eyes flick toward the thumb drive sitting on the table between us. Miller and Sato had already been debriefed. The blue list was being decrypted as we spoke. The raid on the precinct had already resulted in 42 arrests. Vance was singing like a bird in a cage, trying to trade names for a lighter sentence. "Hannah was caught at the gate," Kage said, sliding a photograph across the table. It showed Hannah in handcuffs, her silk dress stained and her face a mask of cold fury. "She tried to swallow the key fob, but we were faster. We have the offshore accounts. The syndicate is hemorrhaging, Ren. By sunset, there won't be enough blood left to keep the heart beating." "And Kenji?" I asked. "He's in a high-security ward," Kage said. "He'll live to see the trial. He'll live to see everything he built turned into evidence." She leaned forward, her shadow stretching across the table. "But there's a problem. The second list, the one on this drive. It doesn't just name cops and politicians. It names a name we didn't expect to see." She paused, let the silence hang in the room like a threat. "Miller," she said. The world went still. I felt the air leave my lungs. "No, that's impossible. Miller is the one who brought you the list. He's the one who almost died at the shrine." "Is he?" Kage asked. She flipped a switch on the wall, and the glass of the interrogation room turned transparent. In the room next to ours, Miller was sitting at a table. He wasn't cuffed. He was drinking coffee, talking to a man in a dark suit. "That's Detective Miller's brother," Kage said. "The commissioner. The man who signed off on the syndicate's port contracts for a decade. The list doesn't say Miller was bribed. It says he was the broker." I looked at Miller through the glass. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine for a fraction of a second. There was no guilt in his gaze. Only a cold, calculating indifference. He raised his coffee cup in a silent toast. "He played you, Ren," Kage said, her voice softening. "He used your grief for your sister to get you inside. He used Sato's loyalty to get the access codes. He didn't want to destroy the syndicate. He wanted to own it. He was pruning the branches so he could take the trunk." I felt a surge of cold fury, a heat that burned hotter than the fire in Kenji's office. I had been a pawn for the law, then a pawn for the mob, and finally, a pawn for the very man I thought was my only ally. Every drop of blood I'd spilled, every lie I'd told, it was all for him. "Why are you telling me this?" I hissed. "Because we need the Ghost Protocol file," Kage said. "The one Miller kept on his private server. It's the only evidence that links him to the commissioner. He knows we're looking for it and he's already moving to wipe it." She reached out and uncuffed my hands. "You're the only one who knows his passwords, Ren. You're the only one who lived in his head for 6 months. Get us that file and you walk away. For real this time." I looked at my hands. The skin was raw, the nails bitten down to the quick. I had spent my life being used by men with titles and agendas. I was tired of being the weapon. But as I looked at Miller through the glass, I realized that if I didn't do this, the dragon wouldn't die. It would just change its skin. I don't need his passwords, I said, standing up. I know exactly where he keeps it. I walked out of the interrogation room and toward the glass. Miller was still watching me. I didn't say a word. I just tapped the side of my head and walked away. I knew the location because it was the one place Miller thought I'd never look. The place where my sister died. The old warehouse by the canal. He hadn't just used her death to motivate me. He had used it to hide his sins. I drove through the city, the morning traffic a sea of indifferent faces. I reached the warehouse an hour later. It was a shell of a building, the windows boarded up and the walls covered in graffiti. I entered through the basement, the smell of damp earth and old oil rising to meet me. I found the server hidden behind a false wall in the furnace room. It was a small, black box, humming with the sound of 1,000 secrets. I plugged in the agency's bypass tool and watched as the data began to flow. But as the progress bar reached 50%, I felt the cold sting of a blade against my neck. I knew you'd come here, Rin, a voice whispered. It was Sato. He wasn't working for the agency. He wasn't working for Miller. He was working for himself. The file, Rin, Sato said, his voice a low growl. Give it to me and I'll let you walk out of here. What do you want with it, Sato? I asked, my heart hammering. I spent 10 years in the dark for this family, Sato said. I'm not letting a bunch of bureaucrats in suits take it all away. That file is my leverage. It's my pension. It's blood money, Sato, I said. It's all blood money, Rin, he hissed. Now, step away from the server. I looked at the screen. 60%. I had to buy time. Miller's brother is already in custody, I said. The agency has the offshore accounts. Even if you get this file, you have nowhere to go. I have the world, Rin, Sato said, his eyes burning with a desperate light. With these names, I can buy any city I want. Now move. He pressed the blade deeper into my neck. I felt a trickle of blood run down my collar. I reached for the server, my fingers hovering over the delete key. If I can't have it, no one can, I said. Don't you dare. Sato lunged, his blade a silver streak in the dim light of the furnace room. I didn't reach for the delete key, I reached for the heavy iron fire poker leaning against the brickwork. I swung with every ounce of my desperation, the metal clanging against Sato's knife and sending sparks dancing into the dark. We were two ghosts fighting in a tomb. Sato was faster, a shadow conditioned by a decade of violence, but I was fueled by something he didn't have, the need for an ending. He slashed at my chest, the blade catching the fabric of my jacket, but I stepped inside his guard and slammed my elbow into his reconstructed jaw. He grunted, the sound wet and guttural, but he didn't falter. He spun, his foot catching me in the ribs and throwing me back against the humming server rack. You're a waiter, Rin? Sato spat, his eyes wild. A tool. I was the one who built this. I'm the one who deserves the spoils. You're just another head of the dragon, Sato? I yelled, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked at the screen. 85%. The blue bar was a sliver away from the end. Sato saw the screen too. He let out a roar of rage and dove for the server, his knife raised to slice the cables. I tackled him mid-air, our bodies slamming into the concrete floor. We rolled through the dust and the grime, a tangle of limbs and fury. I felt his fingers lock around my throat, his grip like iron. The world began to dim at the edges, the hum of the server fading into a dull roar in my ears. The names belong to me, Sato hissed, his face inches from mine. I reached out, my fingers clawing at the floor. I found a loose brick, cold and heavy. I didn't think. I swung. The impact was a dull thud that vibrated up my arm. Sato's grip loosened, his eyes rolling back in his head. He slumped over me, his weight a suffocating heat. I pushed him off, my lungs burning as I sucked in the stale air. I scrambled to the server. 99%. Upload complete. The screen flickered, a green checkmark appearing in the center of the darkness. It was done. Kage had the file. Miller's Ghost Protocol was now agency property. I leaned against the server rack, my forehead resting on the cool metal. It was over. The names, the bribes, the betrayals, they were all in the light now. I looked down at Sato. He was breathing, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven strokes. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man who had stayed in the dark for too long. I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, a wailing chorus that grew louder with every second. The agency was coming. I looked at the back door of the warehouse, the one that led to the canal. I could stay. I could testify. I could be the hero the director wanted me to be. But as I looked at the blood on my hands, I realized that heroes don't exist in this world. There are only survivors and victims. And I had been both for long enough. I walked to the back door and stepped out into the morning air. The canal was a mirror of gray and silver, the water reflecting the awakening city. I walked along the towpath, my footsteps silent on the damp concrete. I didn't look back when the black SUV screeched to a halt in front of the warehouse. I didn't look back when I heard Miller's name being called over a loudspeaker. I reached the bridge and looked down at the water. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small silver pen Hannah had used on me, the paralytic. I looked at it for a moment, then tossed it into the canal. I watched it sink, a tiny ripple in the vast, indifferent current. I walked toward the train station, the same one I had arrived at hours ago. I bought a ticket for the furthest destination on the map. I didn't care where it went. I just wanted to go. As the train pulled away from the platform, I saw Director Kage standing on the bridge. She was looking at the warehouse, her face a mask of cold satisfaction. She didn't see me. No one saw me. I was a ghost again. But this time I was a ghost by choice. I sat by the window and watched the city disappear. The Roppongi building, the harbor, the shrine, they were all memories now, fading into the haze of the horizon. I thought about Hannah, somewhere in a cell, and Kenji waiting for a trial that would never end. I thought about Sato waking up in a world that no longer had a place for him. And I thought about my sister. I thought about her laugh, the way she used to braid her hair, the way she promised we'd always look out for each other. I realized that the debt wasn't settled by the arrests or the files. It was settled because I was still here. I was the part of her that survived. I closed my eyes and let the rhythm of the train pull me into a deep, dreamless sleep. I wasn't listening for secrets anymore. I was just listening to the world. And for the first time in my life, the world was quiet. If this story broke your heart the way it broke mine, leave a like so I know to tell more stories like this. The town of Ataru was a whisper of salt and snow. I had been here for 3 months, living in a small room above a fish market. My days were measured in the movement of the tides and the smell of the sea. I worked on the docks, hauling crates of crab and salmon, my body becoming hard and lean from the labor. No one knew my name. To the fishermen, I was just the quiet one. And I liked it that way. I sat on the pier every evening, watching the sun sink into the Sea of Japan. The water here was different than in Tokyo. It was wilder, colder, a deep indigo that seemed to swallow the light. I thought about the pier in the harbor, the gun against my head, the taste of the bay. It felt like a lifetime ago. One evening, as the first flakes of winter began to fall, a man approached me on the pier. He was tall, with a long coat and a hat pulled low over his eyes. He didn't look like a fisherman. He looked like a memory. "The northern air suits you, Ren," the man said. It was Sato. I didn't reach for a weapon. I didn't even stand up. I just looked at the horizon. "How did you find me?" "The agency has its limits," Sato said, sitting down next to me. He looked older, his face a map of scars and weariness. But a man who knows the dragon knows how to follow the trail of a ghost. "What do you want, Sato?" "I wanted to say thank you," he said, his voice a low rasp. "For the brick. If you hadn't knocked me out, I'd be in a cell next to Kenji. The agency thinks I died in the fire at the warehouse." Kage was happy to have a clean slate. "And Miller?" "Life without parole," Sato said, a grim smile on his lips. "His brother took a plea deal. They're both in the same prison in separate wings. They'll never see the sun again." I nodded, the news falling over me like a blanket. It was done. Truly done. "I'm leaving, Ren," Sato said, standing up. "Heading south. To a place where the names don't matter." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small wooden box. He placed it on the pier between us. "This belongs to you." He turned and walked away, his silhouette disappearing into the falling snow. I waited until I could no longer hear his footsteps before I opened the box. Inside was a single, silver earring. It was Hannah's. The one she had been wearing the night she disappeared from my life 5 years ago. And beneath it was a small handwritten note in her script. "Forgive me, brother. I stayed in the dark to keep the light on for you." I felt a sob rise in my throat, a wave of grief and relief that I had been holding back for years. She hadn't been a victim, she had been a protector. She had climbed the ranks of the syndicate to ensure that the search for me would always come up empty. She had become the monster to save the man. I held the earring against my palm, its cold metal a bridge to the past. I looked out at the sea, the snow falling faster now, covering the world in a shroud of white. I thought about the 6 months of silence, the wire, the lies, and the blood. It was a heavy price to pay for a life. But as I watched the first light of a lighthouse flicker in the distance, I knew it was worth it. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I wasn't a weapon. I was a brother. I was a man. And for the first time in my life I was home. I stood up and walked back toward the fish market, the earring tucked safely in my pocket. The wind was cold, but the fire in my heart was steady. I had a life to live, and I would live it for both of us.